story of Julius Caesar's transformation into a legend does not begin on a battlefield strewn with swords and shields, but in the crowded, dangerous heart of Rome itself. In the mid-1st century BCE, the Roman Republic was a political tinderbox, a place where ambition could raise a man to near-divine heights, or see him crushed into obscurity, forgotten by history. This was the Rome Caesar inherited, a city riddled with corruption, dominated by aristocrats, and perpetually torn between reform and repression. Caesar was not born into obscurity, nor was he among Rome's highest nobility. He belonged to the ancient Julian clan, a patrician family that proudly claimed descent from the goddess Venus herself. Yet by Caesar's youth, the family's influence had faded, its power eclipsed by rivals. Caesar's childhood offered prestige in name, but little in the way of security. Worse still, his uncle by marriage was Gaius Marius, the brilliant general who had reformed Rome's army but whose bloody rivalry with Lucius Cornelius Sulla had nearly torn the republic apart. When Sulla seized power as dictator, Caesar's connection to Marius nearly cost him his life. He was stripped of his inheritance, hunted, and forced into hiding. Only through cunning, persuasion, and sheer luck did Caesar escape execution. This brush with death was more than survival, it shaped him. For the rest of his life, Caesar understood that Roman politics was not a game of polite debate but one of survival. Reputation, alliances, and displays of power meant everything. From that moment forward, he would pursue ambition with a relentlessness that bordered on the divine. By his late 20s, Caesar had begun carving out his reputation. He distinguished himself as an orator in the courts, a master of rhetoric whose words could sway crowds like few others in Roman history. He also sought opportunities in the army, earning recognition for his bravery in Asia Minor and the capture of the pirate stronghold in the Mediterranean. Famously, when captured by pirates as a young man, Caesar mocked his captors, insisting they raise his ransom because he was worth more. Then, once freed, he returned with a fleet, hunted them down, and had them crucified. This was not merely bravado, it was a statement to the world: Julius Caesar would not be underestimated. Yet reputation in Rome was built on more than daring tales. To rise in politics, one needed money, patrons, and visibility. Caesar mastered the art of spectacle. As aedile, he staged lavish public games, so extravagant that he drove himself deep into debt. Gladiators clashed, exotic animals prowled the arenas, and the common people roared their approval. To his enemies, he was reckless; to the people, he was unforgettable. His debts, far from a weakness, became a weapon. The more he owed, the more he was forced to achieve, because failure meant financial ruin. Ambition became survival. But Rome was not kind to dreamers. Its Senate was controlled by entrenched elites who viewed rising men like Caesar with suspicion. To them, he was dangerous, too charming, too popular, too ambitious. Caesar needed something that would elevate him beyond the grasp of jealous rivals, something that would place him in a category above mere politicians. In the Republic, that something was military glory. The Roman world worshipped victory. Generals who triumphed in foreign wars could ride through the city in a procession of splendor, hailed as saviors, immortalized in monuments. Without military conquest, Caesar's political career would stall, his debts would crush him, and his enemies would circle like vultures. With conquest, he could rival the great names of Roman history: Marius, Sulla, even Alexander the Great, whom Caesar famously wept over, lamenting that by his age Alexander had conquered half the known world. By the late 60s BC, Caesar maneuvered himself into a position of growing influence. He secured priesthoods, held magistracies, and forged alliances with powerful men. His charm won him the loyalty of Rome's lower classes, his cunning won him temporary peace with the Senate, and his relentless drive brought him into partnership with two figures who would change the Republic forever: Pompey the Great, Rome's most celebrated general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, its wealthiest man. Together they formed what history remembers as the First Triumvirate, an informal alliance that allowed them to dominate Roman politics. Yet even within this powerful trio, Caesar remained the junior partner. Pompey commanded armies. Crassus commanded wealth. Caesar had debts and ambition. He needed a stage worthy of his talents, a theater of war where he could forge his name in fire and blood. That stage would be Gaul, a land of vast forests, tribal chieftains, and warriors who terrified even hardened Roman soldiers. In 58 BCE, Caesar received command of Cisalpine Gaul, Illyricum, and later Transalpine Gaul, a region that put him at the doorstep of the Celtic world. Officially, his mission was to defend Roman allies and maintain order. In reality, it was an open invitation: conquer Gaul, and you conquer not only land but glory itself. But the risks were staggering. The Gauls were fierce, proud, and divided, yet capable of uniting when threatened. Entire Roman armies had been annihilated in Gaul in centuries past. For Caesar, the gamble was clear: victory would lift him above every rival in Rome. Defeat would not only end his career but likely his life. And so, Julius Caesar marched north, not as the legendary conqueror we remember, but as a desperate man chasing glory, carrying with him the weight of debt, ambition, and a burning need to prove himself. The stage was set, the dice cast. What awaited him in Gaul would not only test his genius but decide the fate of Rome itself. To understand the battle that would turn Julius Caesar into a legend, we must first leave behind the marble columns of Rome and step into the wild, untamed lands of Gaul. Stretching from the Alps in the east to the Atlantic Ocean in the west, Gaul was a patchwork of dense forests, rolling hills, and fertile plains. But it was not a single nation. It was a mosaic of tribes, Celts, each with their own leaders, traditions, and ambitions. To Roman eyes, Gaul was a land of both opportunity and danger. Traders whispered of its wealth: salt mines, rivers brimming with fish, fertile fields that could feed armies. Yet soldiers spoke of its warriors, fierce men who painted their bodies, charged into battle bare-chested, and wielded long swords with terrifying ferocity. To Romans trained in the rigid discipline of the legion, these warriors seemed reckless, even barbaric. But behind the ferocity lay courage, pride, and a refusal to bow easily to foreign masters. Celtic society was built on kinship and honor. Chieftains led by persuasion as much as power, their authority tied to personal reputation. Loyalty was to tribe first, not to a nation. This fragmentation was both Gaul's strength and weakness. It meant tribes could muster fierce armies in times of need, but it also meant they quarreled endlessly among themselves, turning on one another as often as they stood united. For centuries, Rome had exploited this division, forming alliances with some tribes while crushing others. Yet beneath the tribal rivalries, there was a shared culture. The Gauls worshipped a pantheon of gods tied to nature, gods of rivers, forests, and the sky. Their druids, wise men and priests, held immense influence, guiding both spiritual and political decisions. Druids taught that death was not the end, but a passage to another life. This belief made Gallic warriors particularly dangerous, for to die in battle was not an end but a form of honor. By the mid-1st century BCE, the pressure from Rome was growing unbearable. Trade and Roman influence crept deeper into Gaul, eroding traditions, creating dependency, and stirring resentment. Many tribes began to see that unless they stood together, they would be consumed one by one. Out of this rising storm, a new leader emerged, one who would become Caesar's greatest rival, Vercingetorix. Vercingetorix was a chieftain of the Arverni tribe, born into privilege but forged in fire. His very name means victor of 100 battles. He was tall, imposing, and charismatic, with a gift for uniting men across tribal lines. Unlike many Gallic leaders, Vercingetorix grasped the magnitude of the Roman threat. He understood that Rome was not merely another enemy tribe but a relentless empire whose appetite for conquest knew no bounds. Where others saw Rome's discipline as invincible, Vercingetorix saw opportunity. He believed the Gauls could use their knowledge of the land, their mobility, and their passion for freedom to counter Rome's rigid formations. His rise was not without resistance. Many Gallic nobles distrusted him, unwilling to give up their independence. But through a combination of force, persuasion, and vision, he began welding the fragmented tribes into something Rome had always feared: unity. His message was simple but powerful: fight together, or perish separately. For Caesar, this unity was both a challenge and a chance. If he could crush Vercingetorix, he would prove himself not only as a conqueror of tribes but as a master strategist capable of breaking the strongest resistance Rome had ever faced in Gaul. For the Gauls, Vercingetorix represented hope, the chance that for once, the proud Celtic people might throw back the tide of Roman expansion and preserve their way of life. Thus, the stage was set for a clash not just of armies, but of worlds. On one side stood the Roman legions, disciplined, hardened, and commanded by a man whose ambition knew no limits. On the other side stood the Gauls, fierce, passionate, driven by the desperate dream of freedom, and led by a warrior who refused to bend to Rome. The tension was clear. The forests of Gaul would soon echo with the clash of swords and the cries of men. And when these two forces collided, history itself would tremble. When Julius Caesar first marched into Gaul, he did not yet know that his destiny would be forged there. What began as a defensive command quickly spiraled into one of the most audacious campaigns in Roman history. Each year brought new battles, new risks, and new triumphs, but also new enemies, as the tribes of Gaul realized that Caesar's ambitions reached far beyond mere defense. One of Caesar's earliest challenges came from the Helvetii, a powerful tribe attempting to migrate across Gaul in search of new lands. Their movement threatened Rome's allies, and Caesar seized the opportunity. At the Battle of Bibracte in 58 BC, he crushed the Helvetii in a bloody confrontation, forcing survivors back to their homeland. It was a victory that immediately cemented his reputation. The Senate in Rome praised him, his soldiers trusted him, and his enemies began to whisper his name with fear. But Caesar was not content with one victory. His eyes turned to the Germanic tribes pressing on Gaul's borders. To prove that Rome could not be challenged, he did something extraordinary. He ordered his legions to construct a massive wooden bridge across the mighty Rhine River. Within just 10 days, the impossible was achieved, a feat of engineering that stunned even his enemies. Caesar marched his legions across the Rhine, raided Germanic lands, and then withdrew, burning the bridge behind him. It was not conquest he sought in that moment, but awe. He wanted the world to know that no barrier, not even one of Europe's greatest rivers, could contain Rome. From there, Caesar's ambition carried him further still. Twice he led expeditions into the mist-shrouded island of Britain, a place Romans regarded with both curiosity and fear. Though these expeditions were small and temporary, they added to Caesar's legend. Who else but Caesar would dare to sail beyond the known world? His men followed him with growing devotion, not only because he led them to victory, but because he shared their hardships. Caesar marched at the front, fought in the thick of battle, and rewarded loyalty with both coin and glory. Yet the more Caesar triumphed, the greater the resistance grew. The tribes of Gaul began to recognize that Caesar's victories were not isolated, they were systematic, part of a grand design to bring all Gaul under Roman control. One by one, tribes that had once cooperated with Caesar turned against him. Rebellion spread like wildfire. Cities that had surrendered rose up again. Ambushes and guerrilla attacks harassed the legions. At the heart of this resistance rose Vercingetorix. Where earlier chieftains had fought Caesar tribe by tribe, Vercingetorix offered something new: strategy and unity. He adopted a scorched earth policy, ordering villages and farms destroyed so Caesar's legions would struggle to find food. He used cavalry to strike swiftly and vanish, frustrating Roman discipline. He promised the Gauls that together they could bleed Caesar dry. For the first time, Caesar found himself not simply campaigning for glory but fighting for survival. Each march deeper into Gaul carried the risk of disaster. Each alliance he had carefully crafted threatened to unravel. The stakes were no longer just political or personal, they were existential. If Caesar lost, Rome would lose Gaul, and his enemies back home would destroy him. The road to showdown was clear. Caesar's brilliance and ambition had carried him to the heights of power, but now he faced the most dangerous adversary of his career. The clash with Vercingetorix was inevitable, and when it came, it would test everything Caesar had built: his army, his strategy, and his very claim to greatness. The summer of 52 BCE brought Julius Caesar to the most dangerous moment of his career. His conquests in Gaul had made him famous, but Vercingetorix's rebellion threatened to undo everything. 4 months, the Gallic leader had outmaneuvered him, using scorched earth tactics, cutting supply lines, and avoiding pitched battles. But now, Vercingetorix made a critical choice. He retreated with his army into the fortified hilltop city of Alesia, in modern-day Burgundy. Alesia was no ordinary settlement. Perched high on a plateau, surrounded by steep slopes and rivers, It was a fortress by nature and by design. The Gauls believed it was impregnable. Inside, tens of thousands of warriors gathered, along with civilians who sought refuge. From this stronghold, Vercingetorix sent word across Gaul, summoning every able-bodied man to rise and march against Rome. Most generals would have turned away. To besiege Alesia meant trapping oneself deep in enemy territory, far from supply lines, surrounded by hostile tribes. One mistake, and Caesar's entire army could be annihilated. But Caesar was not most generals. He understood that if he allowed Vercingetorix to slip away, the rebellion would grow until all Gaul was lost. So he made a gamble that seemed insane. Instead of retreating, he ordered his legions to build a wall around Alesia. This was no simple barricade. Caesar's engineers designed a massive system of fortifications stretching nearly 11 miles around the city. Ditches, palisades, watchtowers, and traps created a deadly barrier. The goal was simple: starve the Gauls into submission. Every day, Roman soldiers worked tirelessly, driving stakes, digging trenches, and erecting ramparts under constant harassment from Gallic sorties. Arrows, javelins, and stones rained down, yet the Romans pressed on with mechanical discipline. Slowly, the ring around Alesia tightened. But Caesar knew the greater danger was not inside the city, it was outside. If Vercingetorix called for aid, a massive relief force would descend upon them. To prepare, Caesar did something unprecedented. He ordered a second wall of fortifications, this one facing outward. When completed, his legions would be encircled between two rings, one keeping the Gauls in, the other keeping reinforcements out. Trapped between two enemies, cut off from Rome, Caesar was effectively building his own prison. And then the relief force came. Ancient sources tell us that as many as 250,000 Gallic warriors gathered to break the siege, an army dwarfing Caesar's 60,000 men. The countryside thundered with the sound of their arrival. Torches blazed across the hills as the great host encamped around Alesia. For the first time, Caesar and his legions faced annihilation from two sides. Inside the city, Vercingetorix's warriors prepared to strike out. Outside, the relief army prepared to smash in. The days that followed were among the most desperate in Roman history. The Gauls launched wave after wave of assaults, testing the Roman lines. Towers burned, trenches filled with bodies, and hand-to-hand combat raged across the walls. Roman legionaries fought with grim determination, holding the fortifications under impossible pressure. Caesar himself rode along the lines in his red cloak, a visible symbol to rally his men. He reminded them that their survival, and Rome's future, depended on their courage. The final assault nearly broke them. The relief army coordinated with Vercingetorix's forces from within, attacking at multiple points. Roman defenses bent, faltered, and nearly collapsed. At a critical moment, Caesar threw in his Germanic cavalry, circling behind the attackers and striking them in the rear. Panic spread through the Gallic ranks. What had seemed like certain victory turned to chaos. The relief army broke and fled, leaving Alesia isolated. Inside the city, starvation set in. Supplies were gone. Families were reduced to desperation. Some accounts describe the Gauls expelling women and children to save food, only for them to be trapped between the walls, dying of hunger and thirst. For Vercingetorix, the writing was on the wall. His great gamble had failed. At last, he made his decision. Mounted on his warhorse, clad in armor, Vercingetorix rode out of Alesia and presented himself before Caesar. In a gesture remembered for centuries, he dismounted, laid down his weapons, and surrendered. To the Gauls, it was a moment of heartbreak. To Caesar, it was the moment that transformed him from a rising politician into a legend. The siege of Alesia was over. Against impossible odds, Caesar had turned the trap into a triumph. His genius had prevailed, and Gaul was effectively broken. But the cost, the blood spilled, the lands ravaged, the people enslaved, would haunt the memory of Rome and Gaul alike. The thunder of battle had faded. The smoke of burning siege works drifted over the hills. Outside the walls of Alesia lay the corpses of thousands, Roman and Gallic alike. Inside the fortress, silence hung heavy. The once proud army of Vercingetorix was broken, starving, and without hope. The siege was over, and with it, the dream of a free and united Gaul. 4 days after the relief army's collapse, the Gauls inside Alesia clung to the impossible. Some still believed reinforcements would return. Others spoke of breaking out in one final, desperate charge. But reality was inescapable. Their food was gone, their wounded were dying, and their families had endured weeks of misery. What had begun as a glorious stand for freedom had become a nightmare of hunger and despair. The most haunting moment came when the decision was made to expel non-combatants from the city. Women, children, and the elderly were pushed out through the gates, sent toward the Roman lines in hopes that Caesar would show mercy. But mercy was not in Caesar's plans. He refused them passage, leaving them trapped between the walls of Alesia and the Roman fortifications. There, without food or water, they perished, a grim reminder of the ruthlessness of ancient warfare. Vercingetorix, the man who had once united tribes with promises of victory, now faced an unbearable truth. His people were dying, and further resistance would only prolong their suffering. He could fight to the death, but what would that achieve? Caesar would still claim victory, and the Gauls would still be enslaved. In this crucible of despair, he made a choice that elevated him beyond a mere chieftain. He chose to sacrifice himself for his people. The moment of surrender was unforgettable. Ancient writers describe Vercingetorix emerging from the gates of Alesia, mounted on his great warhorse, clad in shining armor. Before the silent Roman lines, he rode proudly to Caesar's camp. There, he dismounted, removed his weapons, and cast them at Caesar's feet. Kneeling before his conqueror, he offered himself as prisoner. It was a scene heavy with symbolism. To the Romans, it was the ultimate triumph, the proud barbarian king humbled before the genius of Rome. Caesar had not only won a military victory, he had staged a spectacle that would echo across the Republic. To the Gauls, it was tragedy made flesh, their leader, who had embodied the hope of independence, reduced to a captive. The aftermath was brutal. Tens of thousands of Gauls were slaughtered or sold into slavery. Entire tribes were broken, their lands parceled out as spoils of war. Gaul's dream of freedom had ended at Alesia, and Caesar's name was forever etched into history as the man who had crushed it. For Caesar, this was more than a battle won. It was the fulfillment of his ambition. He had faced overwhelming odds, and through discipline, engineering, and sheer will, he had triumphed. Vercingetorix's surrender was not just the fall of a leader, it was the moment Caesar's legend was born. The fall of Alesia did not simply mark the end of a battle, it marked the transformation of Julius Caesar from an ambitious commander into a living legend. With Vercingetorix in chains and Gaul broken, Caesar stood unrivaled. The conquest secured him unimaginable wealth, vast new territories for Rome, and above all, the loyalty of his battle-hardened legions. News of the victory spread like wildfire. In Rome, the Senate grudgingly acknowledged his achievement, but to the common people, Caesar was a hero without equal. His triumph in Gaul became the stuff of legend, immortalized in the very words he later penned in Commentarii de Bello Gallico. To generations of Romans, these campaigns read not as history, but as epic, Caesar himself cast as both narrator and conqueror. Yet the true significance of Alesia lay not only in Caesar's personal glory. The battle reshaped the map of Europe. Gaul, once a patchwork of tribes, became a Roman province. Roads, cities, and Roman law followed, forever altering the cultural landscape. But beneath this veneer of civilization lay scars of conquest, hundreds of thousands dead, enslaved, or displaced. For the Gauls, Alesia was remembered not as a glorious defeat but as the moment their freedom was extinguished. For Caesar, however, the victory was a stepping stone to even greater ambitions. With his legions at his back and his reputation towering over every rival, he now stood poised to challenge the very republic he had served. The Senate, fearful of his power, demanded he disband his army and return as a private citizen. Caesar knew that to obey meant political ruin, and perhaps assassination. To defy them meant civil war. And so, the shadow of Alesia stretched forward into history. The same genius and audacity that had broken Vercingetorix would soon carry Caesar across the Rubicon, ignite the Roman Civil War, and ultimately end the Republic itself. In that sense, Alesia was more than a battle. It was the turning point where ambition became destiny, where a man became a myth. The hilltops of Gaul, soaked in blood, crowned Caesar with the mantle of legend. But they also sowed the seeds of betrayal, tyranny, and his eventual fall. For in the ancient world, as in ours, no victory came without a price.